the gang war that ripped through America's prisons. Before we go any further, if you're drawn to the darkest corners of real crime, the stories they don't want told, hit subscribe, tap like, and drop a comment. Because once this door opens, there's no turning back. Lockdown. The first alarm screamed at 2:17 a.m. Red strobes washed the concrete corridors in a pulsing glow, turning steel bars into flickering blades of light. Somewhere deep inside the prison, men were already shouting, some in panic, some in triumph, most in fear. By the time the second alarm joined the first, correctional officers were running, boots slamming against concrete, radios crackled with fragments of a disaster no one fully understood yet. Cell Block D was silent. That alone was wrong. When officers reached the tier, they found the doors hanging open like broken teeth. Smoke curled lazily from a trash can fire defiant, filling the air with a sharp sting of burning plastic. And in the middle of the walkway, under the flickering fluorescent lights, lay a body. The man was face down, arms twisted beneath him, orange jumpsuit soaked dark at the back. A crude symbol had been carved into the fabric near his shoulder blade. Not deep enough to kill, but deliberate enough to send a message. It wasn't random. It was a signature. Within minutes, the prison went into full lockdown. Doors slammed shut across 6 housing units. Inmates were ordered to the ground, hands behind their heads. Medical staff rushed in, but they already knew. The man on the floor was gone. His name was Daniel Mercer, 36 years old, serving a 10-year sentence for armed robbery. And until that night, he'd been one of the quiet ones. No write-ups, no enemies on paper. On paper, by sunrise, word had spread beyond the razor wire. State police arrived first, then federal agents. The prison's warden, a stiff-backed man with 25 years in corrections, stood before a growing crowd of investigators and said the one thing that made every veteran in the room uneasy. This wasn't an isolated incident, he said. This was a warning. 200 miles away, in a windowless office cluttered with case files and cold coffee cups, Special Agent Rachel Monroe watched the grainy surveillance footage on repeat. She'd seen prison violence before, stabbings over debts, fights sparked by insults, but this was different. The cameras showed doors opening in sequence, lights going out at precise intervals, guards diverted seconds before the assault. Coordination. Monroe paused the video and leaned closer to the screen. A shadow passed across the lens just before the camera went dead. Whoever had planned this new system knew the routines, knew exactly how much time they had. Her phone buzzed. Another call from another facility. Same symbol. The voice on the other end said, different inmate, different prison. Monroe closed her eyes. By noon, 2 more men were dead. One in a maximum security prison in Arizona, another in a private facility in the Midwest. All found during routine counts. All marked the same way, all with no obvious connection except the prisons themselves. The media called it a coincidence. The union called it a failure of security. Monroe knew better. This was a war. Daniel Mercer hadn't been important enough to die like that. That was the problem. When Monroe and her team dug into his file, they found nothing that explained the message carved into his back. No gang affiliation, no informant history, no known conflicts. But buried deep in the paperwork was a transfer request filed 6 months earlier, quietly denied and almost forgotten. Mercer had asked to be moved out of state. The reason listed was vague, safety concerns. When Monroe tracked down the counselor who'd signed off on the request, she got a different story. The woman was pale, hands shaking as she spoke. He came to me scared, she said. Not paranoid scared. He said something big was coming, that groups inside were aligning, sharing resources, communicating across prisons. He said if I wrote it down, I'd put a target on my back. Monroe asked why she hadn't reported it. The counselor looked at the floor. Because 2 weeks later, he came back and told me to forget everything he'd said, that he'd handled it. Handled it how? That question haunted Monroe as more reports flooded in. Fights erupting simultaneously in different states. Contraband appearing in facilities that had been locked down for months. Inmates who'd been enemies for years suddenly standing side by side. The old rules were gone. Inside the prisons, rumors moved faster than guards. Whispers slipped through vents and under doors. Names were spoken carefully, never too loud. Some inmates refused meals. Others slept in shifts, backs to the wall, waiting for the sound of keys that might never come. A veteran lifer in Texas told an officer, "This ain't about turban anymore. This is about control." Control of what became clearer 3 days later when a transport bus was ambushed on a rural highway. The attackers vanished before backup arrived, leaving behind a single burned vehicle and a message spray painted on the asphalt. Balances shifted. For Monroe, the pieces finally started to fit. Prison gangs had always fought each other. That was expected. But this wasn't chaos, it was consolidation. Smaller groups swallowed or wiped out. Leaders disappeared. Messengers moved freely where they shouldn't have been able to. Someone was uniting them. And Daniel Mercer had known. The break came late at night, in the quiet hum of the evidence room. Monroe was reviewing Mercer's recorded phone calls when she noticed something strange. In the weeks before his death, Mercer had made a series of calls that were never answered. Same number, over and over. The number wasn't listed in the prison system. When they traced it, the address came back to a defunct warehouse outside the city condemned, boarded up, officially empty. But utility records told a different story. Power usage spiked every Thursday night. Monroe requested a warrant. By the time the tactical team forced the door, dust filled the air, drifting through beams of flashlight light. Inside, the warehouse wasn't empty at all. Maps were pinned to the walls, prisons marked with dates, arrows drawn between states, names circled in red, codes written in a shorthand only someone from the inside would recognize. And in the center of the room, bolted to the floor, was a heavy steel door. Locked. Fresh scratches surrounded the handle, as if someone had tried and failed to open it in a hurry. Monroe stood there, staring at the door, a cold realization settling in her chest. Daniel Mercer hadn't been a victim. He'd been a messenger, and whatever was behind that door was a reason he never made it out alive. But when the locksmith finally forced it open, what they found inside would prove the prison war was only just beginning. The network. The steel door groaned as it finally gave way, echoing through the empty warehouse like a warning shot. Inside, the air was stale and cold, carrying the faint smell of metal and sweat. Fluorescent lights flickered to life, revealing a room that felt less like a hideout and more like a command center. Desks lined the walls. Laptops sat open, some still warm. Handwritten ledgers were stacked in neat rows, their pages filled with dates, inmate numbers, and cryptic symbols that matched the marks left on the bodies. On one wall, a whiteboard was divided into columns labeled with prison names from across the country: California, Texas, Florida, Illinois, Arizona. Under each name were check marks, arrows, and one word circled in thick red marker: Unified. Rachel Monroe felt the weight of it settle in her chest. This wasn't just coordination. It was administration. In a locked cabinet, agents found burner phones wrapped in plastic, each labeled with a number. When they powered one on, a single text message sat unread. Phase 2 begins tonight. Monroe checked her watch. They had less than an hour. Across the country, guards were already feeling it. In Pennsylvania, a routine cell search turned into a riot when inmates moved with eerie precision, overwhelming officers before retreating just as quickly. In Nevada, a fire alarm drew staff away from a housing unit while 2 prisoners vanished from their cells, later found hiding inside maintenance tunnels no one was supposed to know existed. Every incident followed the same pattern. Fast, clean, no wasted motion. Someone was training them. Back at headquarters, Monroe's team worked through the night, cross-referencing the names and ledgers with prison records. The list wasn't random. Each man had something in common access. Some worked kitchens, others laundry. A few were orderlies assigned near administrative offices. Invisible positions, trusted positions. One name made Monroe stop: Eli Carter. He wasn't an inmate. He was a corrections officer. Carter had transferred between 3 facilities in 5 years, always leaving behind whispers missing equipment, unexplained blind spots in camera coverage, favors granted and never documented. Internal Affairs had flagged him twice, but nothing ever stuck. Now his name was circled on the board, underlined twice. Monroe felt the familiar chill of betrayal. Get me his file. Everything. They found Carter before dawn, sitting in his car outside a suburban apartment complex, hands gripping the steering wheel like he was bracing for impact. He didn't run when agents approached. He didn't argue when they pulled him out and cuffed him. He just sighed. In the interrogation room, Carter stayed at the table, jaw tight. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then, quietly, "You're too late." Monroe leaned forward. "Too late for what?" "For stopping it," he said. "You think this is about gang fighting? This is about ending the fighting." She waited. They were bleeding each other dry. Carter continued. "Years of chaos. Everyone losing. The ones on the outside, lawyers, smugglers, financiers, they wanted stability, predictability, one structure, one voice." "And Daniel Mercer?" Monroe asked. Carter's eyes flicked up. He was proof it could work. A nobody, no colors, no flag. He moved messages without anyone suspecting. When he got scared, he tried to walk it back. That made him dangerous. Monroe felt anger rise, sharp and sudden. "So you killed him?" "I didn't," Carter said, "but I didn't stop it either." While Carter talked, the war kept spreading. A high-ranking inmate in Louisiana was found hanging in his cell, ruled a suicide until someone noticed the same symbol carved faintly into his wrist. In Oregon, a prison accountant vanished on the way home. A car later found abandoned near the river. The network wasn't just inside anymore. Monroe pushed Carter harder. "Who's in charge?" Carter shook his head. "That's the point. There is no single boss. It's a council, representatives. If one falls, the rest keep going." "That's not how gangs work," Monroe said. "That's how corporations work," Carter replied. The comparison lingered, ugly and accurate. Late that afternoon, a break came from an unexpected place. An inmate informant in Colorado, someone Monroe had worked with years earlier, requested protective custody and asked for her by name. When she arrived, he was pale, eyes darting to every corner of the room. "They are calling it the Accord," he whispered. "A truce, but enforced with blood. If you don't join, you disappear. If you talk, your family pays." "Who enforces it?" Monroe asked. The informant swallowed. "Not who. What?" "There's a list. People scheduled to be removed. Guards, administrators, anyone who can't be controlled." He slid a folded piece of paper across the table. Monroe opened it and felt her breath catch. Her own name was there. Security around Monroe doubled overnight, but it didn't ease the pressure. The Accord was anticipating moves before they were made. Warrants hit empty houses. Raids turned up wipe hard drives. Someone inside the task force was leaking information. Suspicion poisoned every conversation. Then, just before midnight, Monroe received a call from the warehouse team. They'd found a hidden server compartment behind a false wall. The data were partially corrupted, but one file remained intact, a video, timestamped just days before Mercer's death. They played it in a darkened room. Daniel Mercer sat in front of the camera, eyes hollow, voice low. "If you're seeing this, it means I failed," he said. "This was supposed to stop the killings. One system, one set of rules. But it's not about peace anymore. It's about power." He leaned closer, as if afraid of being overheard. "They're using the prisons to build something bigger. A pipeline, people in, money out. And the worst part, the person running the numbers isn't locked up." The video cut to black. A new file auto-opened. A single name filled the screen. Someone Monroe trusted. As alarms began sounding again, this time from a federal facility less than 10 miles away, Monroe realized the truth had been sitting in front of him all along. The war wasn't just ripping through America's prisons. It was being commanded from the outside. And Chapter 3 would begin with a choice: expose a mastermind or watch the entire system burn. The Accord breaks. The federal facility went dark at 12:41 a.m. Not a full blackout, just enough to blind the cameras and scramble the locks for 90 seconds. Long enough for a message to be sent. Long enough for someone to disappear. Rachel Monroe was already moving when the call came in. Sirens sliced through the night as a convoy tore toward the prison, red and blue light smearing across wet asphalt. She knew the playbook now. Distraction, precision, silence afterward. Inside the control room, technicians worked frantically, hands flying across keyboards. The outage hadn't been random. It was surgical. One wing, one cell. The missing inmate was a former accountant named Victor Hale, white-collar crime. 15-year sentence, no known enemies. Except Hale had quietly handled commissary contracts years earlier, back when the numbers still mattered more than the knives. Monroe didn't need to ask who'd ordered it. The name from Mercer's video burned in her mind. Evan Cross. Cross wasn't a gangster. He was a consultant, former DOJ analyst turned private sector fixer. He testified before committees, advised states on cost efficiency, and helped privatize systems no one wanted to look too closely at. He also chaired a foundation that funneled money into inmate rehabilitation initiatives, a neat label for programs that move people, goods, and influence through prisons like freight. The Accord wasn't just a truce. It was a supply chain. They found Hale alive, barely wedged behind an electrical panel in a maintenance corridor, hands zip-tied, mouth taped. He'd been spared for a reason. In the infirmary, Hale's eyes fluttered open as Monroe leaned close. Cross, he croaked. He audits everything, keeps the peace by keeping the books. If a facility resists, budgets get cut, transfers get delayed, gangs get desperate. And the killings? Monroe asked. Enforcement? Hale whispered. Outsourced. Hale's heart rate spiked. Alarms chirped. Before he slipped under again, he grabbed Monroe's sleeve with surprising strength. He'll sacrifice anyone, he said, even his own people. Monroe knew exactly who he meant. The task force fractured as the net tightened. Warrants stole. Judges hesitated. Phones rang unanswered. Cross's influence was a fog, no single obstruction, just 1,000 small frictions. Meanwhile, prisons that hadn't joined the Accord felt the pressure. Fights erupted. Supplies vanished. Transfers froze. Cross held the lever. Monroe made a decision that would end her career if it failed. She leaked, not to the press tube blunt, too easy to smother, but to the one place Cross couldn't fully control. Market, procurement records, shell companies, big collusion across states. She seeded the data where auditors, shareholders, and rivals would trip over it. Quietly, irreversibly. Then she waited. Cross moved fast. He always did. A public statement blamed misinterpretations. Lawyers threatened. The nation surged to the right places. But money panics faster than people. Banks froze lines. Partners demanded answers. One of Cross's logistics firms missed payroll. Inside the prisons, the Accord felt it immediately. Payments stopped arriving. Promised transfers stalled. The council argued. Old grudges resurfaced. Peace cracked. They arrested Evan Cross at a charity gala beneath crystal chandeliers. Cameras flashing as he smiled and shook hands. He didn't resist. He didn't even look surprised. In the interrogation room, he was immaculate tailored suit, calm eyes. You're proud of this, he said to Monroe. You broke the machine. I stopped it, she replied. Cross chuckled softly. You slowed it. You think gangs invented organization? I gave them a reason to stop killing each other indiscriminately. I reduced chaos by turning prisons into marketplaces, Monroe said, by ordering deaths. I never ordered anything, Cross replied. I provided incentives. Monroe slid Mercer's video transcript across the table. He tried to stop you. Cross's smile faded just a fraction. Daniel misunderstood the scope, he said, and panicked. And Eli Carter? Monroe asked. Collateral, Cross said, without hesitation. That was enough. The charges came down like rain. RICO, conspiracy, financial crime stacked high enough to blot out the chandeliers. Cross was denied bail. The foundation dissolved. Contract was suspended. A dozen administrators resigned for personal reasons. Inside the prisons, lockdowns lifted cautiously. Some units breathed easier. Others braced for retaliation. The Accord's council splintered, leaders turning on each other as resources dried up. Violence flared, then ebbed, then flared again, messy, human, unmanageable. Monroe testified for days, weeks. Her name was dragged through opinion columns and committee hearings. She slept badly. She kept the bag packed. Then, 3 months later, a guard at a medium security facility in the Midwest found something during morning count. A body, not Daniel Mercer's symbol this time. No carving, No signature, just a folded piece of paper tucked into the man's sleeve. It read, balance. The inmate was new. No affiliations, no record that mattered. On paper, another nobody. Monroe stared at the report, the old chill time. She checked the dates, the transfers, the vendors. Patterns didn't vanish. They adapted. In a visiting room across the state, Evan Cross watched the news on a mounted television. He looked thinner, older. When the anchor mentioned the death, his lips twitched, not a smile exactly, more like recognition. Monroe met his gaze through the glass. You see, Cross said, tapping the screen. Systems persist. Monroe turned away, jaw set. She'd learned the lesson Daniel Mercer paid for. You don't end a war by arresting one general. You end it by starving the battlefield. Outside, dawn broke pale and cold. Somewhere inside the walls, men counted debts and favors, testing the silence for weakness. The prisons hadn't healed, but they'd been exposed. And exposure, Monroe knew, was a first step toward collapse. As she stepped into the light, one thought lingered unwelcome and true. They thought the mastermind was behind bars. But power doesn't need a cell to survive. If this story got under your skin, the next one will go deeper. Stay close.